They branded Alien Princess as property, but he tattooed her real name on his skin. They brought her in chains like she was a weapon, not a person, wrapped in cold restraint cuffs that shimmered with containment fields and sealed. Silence over her lips like a muzzle forged in arrogance. And when I first saw her curled in the corner of Bay 7, knees drawn to her chest, skin bruised from stasis shock, branded with an ID code where a name should have been, I didn't see the infamous asset our commanders called her. I saw someone they'd broken just enough to keep alive, but not enough to let go. And for the first time in months, I felt fury boil under my ribs. Not the kind that erupts loud and fast, but the quiet, steady kind that settles in your bones and waits. They'd told us she was a relic from the Rupture Wars, a bioconstruct, a living remnant of the fallen Arzari Empire. Beautiful and dangerous, designed for diplomacy but repurposed for subjugation. A cultural symbol converted into a political tool, and as she lay half-conscious on the hangar floor while the officers argued about which vault she should be stored. I ignored orders and knelt beside her, saw her eyes flutter open violet, luminous, distant like she was still trapped in a place light couldn't reach, and she flinched when I reached out, not because she feared pain, but because she clearly expected nothing else from touch. Her wrists were raw beneath the manacles, and her back bore the scalded imprint of ownership symbols inked over, then seared in again as if the galaxy couldn't decide what to call her. So they just kept rewriting her like a slate, and I whispered, "Do you have a name?" Because I knew better than to assume they'd let her keep it, and though her lips didn't move, her eyes blinked once slowly, purposefully, as if to say, "Yes, I do," but no one's spoken it in so long, I'm afraid. It might not be real anymore. They called her Object V7362 in the manifest logs, and that was what everyone referred to her as: the object, the Arzari girl, the property. And every time I heard it, my jaw clenched a little tighter, because I knew names had power, and taking one away wasn't just cruelty, it was erasure. That night, I slipped into the archives, deeper than I was authorized, bypassed 3 encrypt layers, and found it buried in the original diplomatic logs from the treaty ships. Her name was Siriel, not a serial number, not a designation, but a name that pulsed with meaning, derived from an Arzari root word that meant to sing light into silence. I printed it onto a tiny chip, soldered it into the inside of my sleeve, and began whispering it to her in private, only in the brief stolen minutes between surveillance sweeps or when the guards grew lazy, and each time I said it, I saw her. Straighten just a fraction, as if her spine was slowly remembering how to hold itself up. They didn't feed her properly, rationed her water like she was machinery, and I started slipping parts of my own meals through the cracks of her holding cell, drawing suspicion from the quartermaster until I claimed a high metabolism in my reports and doctored caloric logs to match. When she was permitted outside for transit protocols, they'd force her to wear a thin collar that blinked in compliance colors: blue for stable, red for erratic, and the day they switched it to red after she merely tried to speak her name. Aloud, I snapped and nearly punched the handler until the captain intervened. That earned me a night in the brig and a formal warning, but Siriel saw. She watched through the energy bars as I was dragged past her containment, her expression unreadable, but her hand curled into a fist just once, deliberately, and that was enough. After that, we had an understanding. I stopped pretending she was a mission asset, and she stopped pretending she hadn't noticed. One night, during scheduled maintenance, I cut the surveillance blind spots a little longer than protocol allowed and slipped into her vault just for a minute. I told myself just to ask if she remembered anything before the branding, and she nodded, barely, then whispered a word I didn't recognize but understood instinctively: Soliana, a sacred term in Arzari culture meaning the moment before healing begins. She said it while placing her palm against my chest, just over my heart. and something changed inside me like tectonic plates shifting beneath a calm sea. I didn't sleep much after that. I started researching ancient Arzari script, not just the language but the ink used in ceremonial naming rites, the pigments drawn from crushed iridescent minerals found only in the starborn temples, and when I found a match in a decommissioned supply depot, I requisitioned it under the guise of equipment testing and smuggled the ink to my quarters. Over the next week, I learned how to write her name in its truest form, not in BASIC, not in colonial script, but in the fractal curves only the Arzari used when binding a soul to memory. The day she was scheduled to be transferred off-world. To an auction ship, yes, auction, because that's what they were doing now with high-value captives, dressing them up in biometric suits and sending them to private buyers under the label specimens of historic interest. I made my choice. I pulled the ink vial from my hidden cache, locked myself in the med bay, and tattooed her name across my chest in blood-mixed pigment. Not just the word Siriel, but its Arzari meaning, phonetic echo, cultural resonance, all of it etched over my heartbeat so she'd never again be without someone who knew who she really was. When I removed the gauze the next day, it burned like fire and light and truth. They caught me the moment I tried to intercept her transfer, my lie unraveling under sensor scans, the vile residue traced back to me, and I stood in front of the captain with my uniform peeled back to show them the ink and said, "She is not your property." She never was. They demoted me instantly, confined me to ground detail, and scheduled Siriel's departure without delay, but that night, a power outage swept the station, one I may or may not have helped initiate with an overclocked relay. Spike, and when the backup generators failed for precisely 6 minutes, enough to trigger a containment breach alert, I was already in motion. I found her vault, manually cut the locks with a pulse torch, and whispered her name again and again until she woke, and when she did, it wasn't as the trembling captive I'd first seen, but as something brighter, stronger, a being reforged from survival and remembrance. She looked at the tattoo on my chest, touched it gently, and whispered one word in return: mine. The escape wasn't clean. We were spotted, chased, fired upon, but in the end, we made it off that cursed station in a stolen scout pod. With damaged nav and barely any fuel, careening through dark sectors as alarms screamed and stars spun outside, the viewport like we were plummeting into the soul of the void itself. But she was beside me, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't silent. She was laughing, quietly, almost brokenly. But it was laughter, and it was real. They moved by night, shadows between the scattered embers of a dying empire, her. Steps hesitant but gaining strength with each hour she was no longer chained, and his steady, always a step ahead, as if shielding her from whatever the fractured galaxy might throw next. She didn't ask where they were going, didn't question the false identities, the forged papers, or why he flinched at every checkpoint. They had crossed into Zone 6 now, where human authorities were thin and alien hunters ran things beneath. The veneer of fragile ceasefires, and though the galaxy called it neutral territory, every wall they passed bore fading propaganda declaring non-humans property, not people, relics of a war that had officially ended but never truly died. And the brand on her shoulder, once raw and inflamed, now hidden beneath medical wrap and faded clothing, still seemed to burn every time a patrol hovered close or a scanner beeped too slowly. She hadn't yet spoken her name to him, and he hadn't asked, not because he didn't care, but because the moment she told him, it would make it real, would bind them in a way deeper than the escape, deeper than the bleeding moon she'd left behind when he broke her free from the cargo manifest where she was listed as biological asset unclaimed. They stayed in a decaying habstack that overlooked the broken skyline of a mining colony long since abandoned by its corporate gods, and in the flickering half-light of malfunctioning bulbs, she sat beside him on cold flooring, watching him burn. Old IDs, documents, digital threads that once tied him to a crew that followed orders, even when those orders involved transporting bound, drugged girls in reinforced crates. And he said nothing when her fingers slowly brushed the upper ridge of his back, where the burn scar was older than the war, older than their meeting. He'd been branded too once, not by force but by system, by the assumption that compliance made him less than complicit, and he hated that it had taken her for him to finally rip free. She startled when he brought out the needle, the ink, the sealant. He had said little, just unwrapped the sterile packet with shaking hands and gestured for her to sit, and for a moment she flinched, a ghost memory of being branded flashing behind her eyes like an electric scream. But then she saw where he pointed, the bare flesh over his heart, and slowly, with the faintest nod, she pressed her fingers against his chest, guiding the strokes of her name in her native script. An elegant curve of 4 alien syllables that had once been sung in temples, now buried beneath human mining rigs and waste yards. And he did not grimace when the ink cut into him, did not cry out when her name bled into his skin. He only whispered the word again and again like a prayer, anchoring it into himself like a promise. And when she placed her hand over it, once it dried, something shifted between them, something irreversible. The next day, she spoke her first, full sentence to him. "If they find me again, don't let them rebrand me." And he answered without hesitation, "They'll have to burn it off my chest to try." And so their journey became something heavier, not just survival, but a slow act of resistance, a rewriting of worth in a galaxy that measured value in obedience and ownership. Days blurred into fugitive rhythm sleep, run, rest, hide, steal if they had to, lie if they must. Never stay long enough for neighbors to ask questions. And all the while her presence grew less cautious, her eyes less hollow, her voice steadier. And he noticed the way she now leaned into sunlight when they passed through warm zones, her skin catching the rays like it had forgotten what it meant to be free, and in rare quiet hours she told him of her homeworld gone now, glassed in the third wave of incursions, its forests flash-burned, its archives pillaged for genetic data and cultural relics that now sat on auction boards as exotic assets. And she asked once why humans cared so little for names, why they reduced everything to numbers, to inventory, and he said he didn't know, but he hated it too. Hated how the galaxy filed people under labels that fit easier into databanks and profit columns than into hearts. She smiled then, the first time he saw her smile without pain behind it, and it broke something in him, a dam he hadn't realized was there. And that night when she reached for his hand, he didn't flinch, didn't ask if she was sure, just let her fingers rest in his as the stars wheeled overhead through a cracked dome window, unblinking and ancient, as if they too were watching. Their final leg would be the hardest crossing into the central orbitary, where the Allied Council still held sway, where his old military records could be used to smuggle her in under asylum status. If only they could get past the human purity, zealots who had taken over the perimeter stations and patrolled with plasma, dogs and neural interrogators, but he didn't tell her how risky it was. How many others like her had been caught at this stage and shipped back in pieces or worse? Because he knew she'd insist on staying behind to protect him, and he would rather burn with her than abandon her in the outer dust. They stole a courier skiff under cover of a sandstorm, disguised her in outdated miner gear, her posture bent and her voice modulated by a throat implant that made her sound like a grizzled man. And for 3 days they drifted, silent and close. In the hull's belly, her pulse syncing with his as the checkpoints drew nearer and the static grew thicker. And when they were finally flagged for boarding, he kissed the edge of her mask and whispered her real name one last time, not as a goodbye but as an invocation. And when the guards came, rifles raised and scanning beams wide, he stood between them and said calmly, "I'm carrying a living declaration," and pulled open his shirt to reveal the tattoo that glowed faintly under scanner light. That resisted erasure because it had been etched with star steel-infused ink, the kind that bonded with dermal cells forever, and when they tried to wipe, it only burned brighter. Her name had become a beacon, a fire he carried, a statement that even if the galaxy forgot her, denied her, branded her, erased her, someone just one had written her into himself, and that made her real beyond any registry. And so the guards hesitated just long enough for her to emerge from behind the panel, eyes blazing, posture tall, voice her own again as she said, "This is who I am. You will not strip me again," and whether it was shock or awe or fear, they were let through, the checkpoint behind them dissolving into starlight, and as the skiff docked in the refugee wing of the orbitary, and the doors sealed behind them, he turned to her and whispered, "You're free now," and she, after a long pause, reached out, touched the tattoo on his chest, and whispered back, "No, we're free." They had taken her again. It was almost poetic in the most twisted way, just when she had begun to taste the wind as her own, just when the alien princess had dared to believe that perhaps the chains welded into her past could rust away beneath the warmth of his touch. The Federation returned with cold iron and cleaner words. Diplomatic seizure, species protection clause, preservation of interstellar property. They didn't use whips anymore, they used law. They didn't call her a slave, now they called her evidence of cultural significance. They dragged her from the mountain village where they had hidden, tranquilized her like an animal, sealed her inside a cryopod, and shipped her back toward the capital under the banner of science, cloaked in authority, drowned in silence. And the human, Ezra, who had burned her false name from her cell walls and inked her true name across his back in eternal strokes, stood frozen beneath the canopy of stars she had begun to smile beneath, with nothing left in his fists but the heat of her last glance. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't run to a senator or plead before a camera. He simply disappeared. For 6 weeks, the galaxy searched for the rogue human they feared might disrupt the Queen's containment. But he was not a soldier. He was not a terrorist. He was a gardener of lost things, and in the silence he began to build. They had taken her to the biodome vault on Wera 9, a cold museum masquerading as a habitat where creatures of extinct empires were put on display behind one-way glass. The alien princess wasn't in chains, but she wasn't free. She wore silks chosen by eye stylists and ate delicacies of her own planet that had been recreated in sterile labs. Her voice was recorded for linguistic archives, her steps observed by anthropologists. They let her speak, yes, but only about things they approved, not about him. Not about the tattoo she had glimpsed glowing on his skin, spelling her name in a script no human had ever written before. Not about the nights when she danced under twin moons with the sound of his laugh tangled in her breath, and yet she endured, because deep down she knew he would come. She didn't know how, or when, or even if he would survive it, but she had learned something about humans, or at least about this human. When he said her name, her real name, it wasn't just sound. It was promise. And across star systems, far from prying eyes, that promise kindled into fire. Ezra had never been a soldier. But grief makes engineers of all of us. He studied the layouts of the biodome, bribed smugglers for schematics, reprogrammed junker bots, and used every ounce of favors owed from every village he had once helped after the war. And one dusk, when the Wera 9 security shift changed, and the museum screens went dim for their annual audit cycle, she heard a sound not heard in that sterile place for centuries. Birdsong. But not just any birdsong, it was the whistle he had once taught her while hiking through the wet canyons of her second hiding place, a tune he claimed could summon luck. Her eyes widened, her breath caught. She turned and he was there, not in armor, not armed with guns, but cloaked in dust, bruised and sleepless, with her name still shining faintly on his shoulder like a vow that never dimmed. He did not speak. Neither did she. They ran. Through security doors that opened with forged pulses, past drones confused by mirrored signals, over fences shorted by midnight sabotage. And when the final gate failed to recognize his ID, he simply placed his bare shoulder against the panel and whispered her name. The system, confused by what seemed like ancient royal script, glitched and opened. Freedom wasn't dramatic. It was silent. It was two figures slipping into the dark, breathing hard, the stars above them unfamiliar yet finally their own. But it didn't last. Within hours, the chase began. The Empire declared a breach of containment. Hullas of the alien princess painted, her as stolen artifact and Ezra as deranged zealot. Even neutral systems issued alerts. They couldn't hide forever. But hiding was never the plan. He took her not to a ship, but to the ruins of the first colony, the one that had once enslaved her people generations ago, now abandoned, forgotten, and claimed by vines. And there, with the time they had left, he built something no one could. Erase, a monument, not in marble, not in metal, but in memory. Using old projectors, stolen tech, and relics encoded with songs of her world, he reconstructed her true story, one not told in museums, but in lullabies and rebellion and quiet, aching love. A living archive hidden in shadow, broadcast only to those who chose to see. And beside it, etched deep into the cliff wall with molten glass, was her name, not the code the empires had stamped onto her, ID, but the real one. The one she had whispered to him one night when the fire had burned low and her heartbeat finally trusted him. And when the Federation finally arrived, surrounding the ruins with ships and threats, she stepped forward not as an exhibit, not as property, but as a queen reborn. This man, she said calmly, standing beside Ezra, did not steal me. He remembered me. And as they fired a stun charge at him, trying to silence her, she stepped in the way. The blast hit them both. But the system blinked, because the ancient neural code on his back, her name, etched into him with sacred pigment, interfered. Something in the old symbols awakened. The Empire had tampered with many species, but they had never understood hers. Her true name wasn't just a title. It was a key. And the moment her voice spoke it, and his body bore it, a signal surged into orbit. Satellites failed. Cameras shattered. And the vaults holding her people's last memories unlocked. Across the galaxy, those who had once bowed their heads began to remember. One by one, old worlds awakened. The Federation, stunned by the cascading code corruptions, couldn't contain it. Truth had slipped beyond their reach. And in the chaos, the human and the alien princess vanished once more. Some say they died. Some say they found a planet of their own, unmarked by law. Others whisper of a temple carved into a meteor drifting beyond charted space, where travelers speak of a man with a glowing name and a woman who sings to the stars, and where no one is branded, no one displayed, and every story, every reel. Name is honored, but none can say for sure. Only this: the stars now carry her name, and it's tattooed not just on his skin, but across time, forever.